Hi everybody, welcome to week 6, and this week what we want to do is start talking about networks. And so for most of the course so far we've really been talking about federalism and various aspects of federalism, including coercive federalism. This week, beginning this week, we want to start talking about really more the business practices for public managers like us in the intergovernmental environment. And so this week we want to spend some time talking about networks. Now, as I go into this lecture, I want you to know I'm going to be referring to both the required readings that I assigned on Blackboard this week, and also I'm going to be referring to some of the optional readings. The optional readings are just that. They're actually pretty good readings, but in a couple cases, they're really good just source material. You know, in particular, the Solomon article is one that you can scan kind of quickly, even though it's over 100 pages long. You can actually scan some of the charts, and it's actually a very useful article for future reference. So I will refer to all the readings as I go through the lecture today, both optional and required. So what do we mean by networks? This is from, in fact, one of the optional readings, Agranoff and McGuire, 2001, and they say that a network is a multi-organizational arrangement for solving problems that cannot be achieved or achieved easily by single organizations. Public management networks are led or managed by government representatives. Simply put, networks constitute emergent phenomena that are distinctive managerial vehicles and that offer challenges for the single organization and its management. So, you know, this definition, what McGuire and Agranoff are doing here is they're contrasting networks against single organizations. So they're multi-organizational, you know, in the first place, as opposed to a single organization or the classic bureaucracy. They say that networks are led by government representatives. Is that always the case? You would think, but you could probably also think of situations where perhaps the government managers sort of fade into the background. But that doesn't erase their accountability. And the reason networks are engaged in is that the problems that are being addressed defy probably the capacity or the ability of the single organization. And so this is why networks are formed. So I want you to engage in just a little thought exercise over the next 2 or 3 slides here. And what if we thought of federalism as a network? So this very simple diagram, you know, a lot of people, when they think of federalism, we talked about a lot of models of federalism, but a lot of people, when they think of federalism, they really think of the hierarchical relationship. So whether that's true or not, in the hierarchical relationship, you know, we would go from national government directing state government, directing local government. So in this sense, federalism, is it really a network, or is it just a single hierarchical relationship that flows downhill? So it's probably not really a network. But now let's think a little more about federalism. Really, federalism involves interchange between the national government and the state government and local networks, local governments, excuse me, and as well as the state and local governments. So we have this sort of three-way, multi-directional interchange of actions between these levels of government. So here we're getting closer to a network. So federalism as a network, various actions going on in both directions between these 3 levels of government. But let's make it a little more complicated. So, you know, what if we threw in the idea, the constitutional idea of separation of powers along with levels of government? So we have the 3 branches of the federal government: the president, the Congress, and the courts. And then on the right-hand side, we also put in the states and cities. And I don't include on this diagram, but I could have included the fact that within states and cities, there is also separation of power. So at the state level, you have the governor and the legislature. At the city level, you typically would have the mayor and the council, or you may have the council hiring a manager. So you have separation of powers at those two levels of government too. But as well, on the left-hand side, we can include departments such as the Department of State, Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Defense, and administrative agencies. So the Federal Communications Commission, for example. And then in this sense, we have interactions between levels of government, President, Congress, and courts, and we have interactions between, that was branches of government. We have interactions between levels of government, states and cities, and each of the states and cities has interactions with the executive department. They have interactions with Congress. They have interactions with the courts. The courts have issued rulings on many aspects of law, some that involve states, some that involve cities, many that involve actions by the Congress, laws, and actions by the administration. And as you know, just this week, the courts upheld the idea of net neutrality, and that was based on a lawsuit that the Federal Communications Commission was involved in. So the courts have interplay with administrative agencies and with departments. So here we see just a very much more complex array of network connections between branches of government, between administrative agencies and departments, and between levels of government. So in a sense, even though the word network is a fairly new word, and certainly the founders didn't have the word network in their vocabulary, in a sense, we could argue that federalism as laid out by them does constitute something of a network. So let's kind of move on from that idea of what the founders might have had in mind, and is federalism a network, to something we were already conversant with, and that's these paradigms of public administration. And those of you who have been in the MPA or Urban Studies program or the certification program a while, you've run into this. One of the first readings you read was, Woodrow Wilson. And then probably you read something by Weber. And, we talk about public bureaucracies. The classic public administration is the idea that there's a single bureaucracy with a functional mission, and it's vertically integrated, and it operates on command and control. So that is what Weber had in mind when he talked about bureaucracies. That's what Gulick had in mind when he talked about bureaucracies. And it's really kind of what Wilson had in mind when Wilson talked about, having an administrative mindset, or, combining administration with the Constitution. Very much a command and control, downward directed bureaucracy. So that's classic public administration. But in the 90s, along came this idea of new public management. And, it was popularized by Osborne and Gabler. They wrote the book Reinventing Government. And really that idea was that the bureaucracy should not be dominant because in a lot of ways it's not cost effective. So really what bureaucracies want to do is contract out part of their work if it's competitive to do so. And so in the new public management, we see the idea not exactly of networking, but the idea of reassigning some government work to private contractors. And so we see competition between contractors, we see concession, and we see compromise. Well, now along comes the idea, there was a reaction to that, and collaborative public management came along, where thinkers started looking at partnerships with private firms and nonprofits and with citizens. So the idea was governance, not management so much. And the central administrative dynamic there was collaboration and cooperation. And now a lot of people want to talk about governance and network administration. So we think in terms of these governance networks. And so in this sense, there is really no one single central administrative dynamic. It could involve command and control. It could involve competition. It could involve collaboration and cooperation. It could involve coordination of effort. So networks are very much a fluid paradigm as compared to, for example, classic public administration. And let me just move on a little bit on that particular idea. So, how does the delivery of government affect these paradigms? Well, classic public administration, again, tells us that government and the delivery of whatever the goods and services of government are, that government operates through bureaucracies. And so you have a mission-focused bureaucracy. You have the Department of Defense that delivers defense, and it's vertically integrated. It controls its products. There's a command and control system with someone at the top, and it's very much in charge of its own product. But in fact, even if we look at just how government services are delivered, we get the idea that classic public administration probably doesn't work. And this comes from this article by Solomon, which is an optional reading. But what he talks about, and you might want to, he has a few tables in the reading that you can glance at. What he talks about is, and this was even in the 1990s, what federal government, its goods and services that it delivers, it mostly doesn't do it by itself. In his research, he found that what he called direct government, that is the government spending money and delivering some product, only accounted for about 28.1% of federal expenditures. Indirect government accounted for about 71.9% of federal expenditures, and that happened through different tools. So some of these tools included contracting out services. It included grants that the federal government gives to states and others. It included vouchers. It included tax expenditures, like, for example, the interest rate, the interest deduction that you get on home ownership is a tax expenditure. It includes loan guarantees, student loan guarantees, for example. Government-sponsored enterprises, and like Fannie and Freddie are famous there, and then deposit insurance. So these are some of the ways that government actually spends money and delivers government guaranteed programs, but it's not directly out of a single agency or several single agency mission focused bureaucracies. And so just from this slide alone, you kind of get the idea, when you get down to the tools of government part, that the delivery of government services is going to require something other than government people. So how does this delivery of government affect these paradigms? Well, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about this Agranoff and McGuire article. They asked several questions about networks in this 2001 article, and they don't really have answers. They're actually questions for further research. But, for example, the classic PA management process, and I'm sure you've seen this term before, this term Positicorb. This is what Luther Gulick came up with in the 1930s. He said that the classic bureaucrat, the top bureaucrat of any vertically integrated bureaucracy, has these management processes to attend to. So planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. And every subordinate manager within the bureaucracy, to some extent, shared in these classic management processes, but each bureaucracy had these processes resident within them. But on the network side, what they say takes the place of Positicorb are these things called activation, framing, mobilizing, and synthesizing. So let's talk about those for a second. So, what are the POSITACORP-like rules for public managers in a network environment? There's this idea of activation, which Agranoff and McGuire say is the activity of identifying members, resources, and the structure if you're standing up a network to accomplish government work. There's the idea of framing, which is identifying rules of the network. How's this network really going to work? Let's describe it. There's the idea of mobilizing, and by this they mean this is almost a strategic planning type of approach, getting key supporters and getting buy-in from people as you're organizing the network. And then synthesizing, which in process of running a network, it's maximizing the interactions. The second question they ask is whether the groupware, what they call groupware, and that really not referring to some kind of software, but they say are group dynamics different in a network versus a bureaucracy? So, for example, in a network, we're looking at the currency is not necessarily authority and the chain of command, but it's information. Therefore, there's more reliance on the idea of social capital. That is the ability and the capacity to make agreements, the ability and the capacity to organize yourself in teams. More reliance on that, again, than just straight command and control. There's the idea of shared learning, and there's the idea of negotiation. And so these group dynamics are a little bit different than the top-down directed bureaucracy. And then they ask, how do networks provide flexibility? Well, they have a few suggestions. They say flexible resourcing. So for example, if you're in a network, all the resources may or may not come from the government side. And there may be an ability to share resources. There may be an ability to borrow resources, if you will. Adaptability to the ability, to adapt to changing markets or environments. So this idea that networks are more flexible than a classic mission function bureaucracy, it's because they have people in the network who can read the environment and adapt more quickly. And then there's this idea of brokers. So what they mean by that is, within the network, people over time become these brokers, the people who can negotiate agreements within the networks. They might even not have that role formally, but they're able to achieve that through probably social capital again. So in their mind, networks provide more flexibility. And then this is a key question in my mind. How do networks handle accountability? So we know in the typical POSITACORP organization that the person at the top is always accountable. That any manager at a low level, mid level, or top level, any manager is always accountable for the people that work for them and for the products they're supposed to deliver. In a network, Agranoff and McGuire talk about this being a little more difficult because sometimes it's difficult to identify who's the principal and who's the agent, who's actually in charge of this and who's delivering products at certain times. And so they recommend that actually accountability switches to this idea of accountability for versus accountability to. So what they mean by that is that within the network, people are responsibility for outcomes versus accountability to overseers, no matter what the outcomes. But they stress that there is this continued need for people in the networks to understand legal responsibility. And so questions 5 and 6 here. What is the cohesion factor compared to bureaucracy? They spend some time in this article talking about trust versus command and control. So you can see that a network really requires trust, and they say it should be based on motives, competency, dependability, collegiality. And again, working in the bureaucracy, there is the complaint about a bureaucracy that those things, trust, for example, and competency, and dependability may or may not be necessary. There's just straight command and control. Do as I say, and it doesn't matter if I trust you or not. That's kind of the sort of the monsterized version of a bureaucracy. But what they're saying is that cohesion is based on a mutual understanding and mutual trust in each other's competency. And so another really important question they ask is, that's all great, but what about this element of power? Who's in charge? And again, their positive take on that is that within a network, you have power to accomplish something versus power over. So I may not have power over my partners in the network, but I have power to accomplish things. And so this gives me a lot more empowerment to actually accomplish things. And so there is this idea of power sharing. But all of this is really tempered with the realization that, in fact, some stakeholders really are more powerful than others. And sometimes within a network, that's a lesson that people have to learn as they go along, because they might not always know who's the most powerful player in a network. And then finally, the bottom line question really is, do networks produce better results? And they refer to a couple of social issues. One is the contention that the pace and quantity of social change necessitates networks. So things move rapidly. We have to come up with agile solutions, and so therefore that necessitates networks. And that some problems are so complicated, as they call them wicked problems, that may necessitate networks. And then finally they ask this question, and they don't necessarily come up with a full answer, but are networks the natural outcome of rapid change? I mean, have we gotten to the point where in order to affect change, we have to have a network? And so we do know that more businesses have entered into networks, and so government, it may naturally be tending towards the same conclusion, that the only way to actually accomplish the job at hand is to form networks. And so in the required reading, in the Kaliba reading, he talks about these several strategies that public managers might use. And if you read this article, he's got a couple of themes in this article, and I'm only just talking about this one chart, but if you read that, what you see that he's talking about is that networks require skills of public managers, and he's basically wondering aloud if we, that would be we, people who run MPA programs, are actually preparing students for the challenges of being a public manager in a networked environment. And so in one part of the article, he talks about these strategies that I as public managers might actually employ. And you can see they're broken down on the left-hand side, running really from the classic PA kind of organization down to systems kind of thinking. So, oversight and mandating, that kind of strategy is classic of classic PA, right? You provide oversight or you mandate things, and in the hierarchical relationship that works pretty well. But as you move into networks, then you have to employ other strategies. So for example, providing resources. That would be the provision of one or two or more kinds of capital resources as inputs into the network. And so, here you can kind of think of this as in a contracting out type environment. I give you money, you pick up the trash for me as assigned. And then negotiation and bargaining. And so now our thinking is getting slightly more complicated. So we're engaging in processes of mutual adjustment and agreement. And you can see how this moves beyond, for example, a simple contracting out relationship where I give you a statement of work and tasks to do. I'm actually engaging you in the process, and we're mutually adjusting our expectations in the agreement, and we're ultimately leading to a common acceptance of how we want the job done. And then they talk about facilitation, where I, as a public manager, I'm not just demanding, I'm actually facilitating the coordination of several players in a network. And I may use incentives to do that. I may use inherent agreements. I may use explicit agreements. And I may use common norms and standards, but I'm facilitating the network. And then there's this idea, again, of brokering or boundary spanning. So within the network, these brokers, people who can negotiate agreements and between the players in the network, are really making great use of their social capital to bridge gaps in the network. And then finally, what they recommend is public managers have to be thinking in a systems way, or situational awareness. And what they mean by that is that, we as public managers need to be aware of what's going on around us and what's unfolding so that we can take advantage of governance networks. And this is the final slide, and this actually is in your required readings. This is the Agronoff 2006 article. I'm not going to go through this in detail, and the reason I'm not is because this is actually the basis of our discussion this week, where I'm going to ask you to look at these rules and comment on them. But it's also your next paper that I'm going to have you write. I'm going to have you write on this paper a reading reflection about what you think of Agronoff's rules. So basically, these 10 rules that Agronoff came up with is based on a lot of his research. And Agronoff and McGuire and several others are the key theorists in governance networks. But these 10 lessons are based on several research projects that Agronoff has conducted. And so what I want you to do for the discussion this week is pick out a couple of these and talk about which ones you think are really important, based on your experience and based on the entire scope of reading that you did for this week. So that's all I have to say about networks in the lecture. As I said, I have the assigned readings. Take a look at the optional ones. They are optional. Just scan them because they are helpful and they fill out the picture a little more. So with that, I'm looking forward to your inputs this week. Thanks very much.